What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Tom Talks. I'm your host, Tom, and today we'll be talking about the Roaring Twenties, the stock market crash of 1929, and the New Deal. We will uncover why it happened, who it affected, and why it all matters today. With me is my guest historian, Loth, and he will be helping us uncover what we have planned for today.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, let's talk about the context of the New Deal. The period before the New Deal was known as the Roaring Twenties. Average Americans increased their travel and consumerism. The population rose by 15% from 1910 to 1920, and most Americans lived in cities and towns by 1920. About 63% of Americans had electricity by the 1920s. The automobile became a staple of the American middle class, and 60% of families owned an automobile by 1930. But why did all this happen?
Well, we have to look at the Roaring Twenties, which really started after World War I. World War I had encouraged technological innovation and industrial growth. Henry Ford, an industrial magnate, used mass production to quickly and cheaply produce automobiles for $300 every 10 seconds. The Republicans, who controlled the presidency at this time, were pro-business and advocated for laissez-faire policies. They stayed away from regulation in hope that this would increase the economic growth. They also avoided interfering directly in people's lives, reduced taxes to increase investments, and allowed trust to increase public production. The Republicans supported protectionism, however, and passed multiple tariffs such as the Fordney-McCumber tariff in 1922 and the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 to keep American products competitive. This limited the amount of American products sold overseas, yet the stock market continued to climb.
Americans must also have had disposable income that was used to purchase stocks on the stock market. But many Americans also bought stocks on credit, assuming that the stock market would continue to rise and they would make money on their investments. The stock market rose from $27 billion in 1925 to $87 billion in 1929, with about 20 million people investing by the time the market crashed.
Correct. The stock market crash began on Black Monday, October 28, 1929, when the market closed down 12.8%. Stock prices collapsed dramatically as investors rushed to sell their shares. In 1930, the stock market recovered some, but still declined again, showing that the crisis would be prolonged.
There were several benefits over the course of the Roaring Twenties, of course. The automobile encouraged economic growth because car-centric infrastructure began being developed. Roads, suburbs, and gas stations began to be developed as well. Advertising and increased wages fueled a consumer culture and productivity. Mass production of refrigerators, radios, and other consumer products commenced due to increased output and demand. Economic growth was also fueled by the exports of these products, as 61% of U.S. exports were consumer goods. Overall, urban workers, middle classes, business owners, and bankers benefited from this period. Unemployment was low, job opportunities were plentiful, wages were higher, consumer products were cheap and abundant, the stock market was increasing, and corporations were growing.
True. However, many farmers, unskilled workers, and minorities suffered from overproduction, discrimination, and consolidation of industries.
Right, so what exactly caused the crash?
A decline in demand and overproduction were a large part of the crash. Stock prices were also to blame, as the government failed to stop the stock market bubble from growing as fast as it did. Stocks were overvalued, and when some sold their stocks, many others followed suit, knowing that purchasing more stock could not be supplemented by profits in the future. The crash also generated a decline in consumer confidence and raised uncertainty about wages, which led to less consumption, less production, and less need for workers. Banking policies also led to bank runs as well, since investors lost confidence and wanted to receive their deposits in hard currency. Banks had to liquidate their loans in order to pay for this, and many still closed due to the lack of money. By 1933, a fifth of banks had failed.
Simultaneously, the federal government failed to keep money in circulation and raised interest rates to protect the value of the dollar. Consumer confidence and investment opportunities continued to decline. The use of the gold standard by many countries at this time in global trade also allowed the depression to spread.
President Herbert Hoover attempted some relief with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided loans to industries and banks to promote recovery. However, Hoover's policies were generally ineffective at solving their crisis, and in fact, the signing of the Smoot-Hawley tariff only served to worsen the crisis.
Hoover's failures led to his loss in the presidential election of 1932. President Franklin Roosevelt was elected on a platform of wider economic recovery, relief, and reform he called the New Deal.
Once FDR was inaugurated, he declared a 4-day bank holiday to prevent bank runs. A lot of legislation was passed during his first 100 days in office. For example, the Glass-Steagall Act created the FDIC to ensure bank deposits. FDR also took the U.S. off of the gold standard. He ordered the Treasury to purchase privately held gold for paper money to promote inflation and stimulate investment. FDR returned to a partial gold standard for international trading purposes in February 1934. Until 1971, foreign bills could be paid in gold at the rate of an ounce per gold at $35.
Let's take a look at some of his New Deal programs. First, the Civil Conservation Corps, or CCC, was a volunteer program for young men. About 3 million young men lived in camps to dig trenches, build reservoirs, and plant trees. They received $30 per month, but 20 of that went back to their families.
The Federal Emergency Relief Administration gave $3 billion to states for relief programs. The Civil Works Administration was established as a branch of the FERA and provided small jobs for the unemployed to complete.
The Agricultural Adjustment Act worked with farmers to reduce overproduction and lent them money so that they could continue to operate. It increased unemployment, however, and was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1936.
The Tennessee Valley Authority was created to provide electrical power to about 2.5 million people who live just west of the Appalachian Mountains. $12 billion was invested in its infrastructure, including dams and power plants. The TVA provided cheap power, employment and environmental restoration, easier water transportation, and flood control.
The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, lent money to homeowners to prevent foreclosures. It helped over 1 million households avoid the loss of their homes.
The National Industrial Recovery Act and the National Recovery Administration attempted to reduce unemployment by limiting working hours and making child labor illegal. The NRA was created to help industry, labor, and the unemployed. Minimum wages and maximum working hours were established, fair competition was codified, and workers were given the right to unionization. However, the Supreme Court unanimously struck it down on the basis that Congress could not delegate powers to the President and that the federal government could not regulate interstate commerce.
The Public Works Administration, or PWA, focused on long-term recovery and larger projects. $4 billion was invested in about 34,000 projects across the country.
FDR reformed the stock market by having Congress pass the Truth in Securities Act, or Federal Securities Act, and Securities and Exchange Commission. These regulations made sellers get their stocks and bonds audited to prove their soundness and security. The SEC protected against insider trading, fraud, and deception.
The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 changed the assimilation policies of the government by restoring some autonomy, protecting native lands, and promoting native cultures. 77 tribes refused to cooperate with the program, however, because they resisted the authority of the government to dictate their way of life.
The Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934 to provide loans for homeowners to both construct and repair houses. The United States Housing Authority was created in 1937 to strengthen the program. Low-cost housing was constructed for 650,000 people, and even though the program met opposition, slums stopped growing and in some cases shrank.
The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, was established in 1935 to complete many projects using unemployed labor. It was similar to the Public Works Administration, but it focused on smaller projects. About $11 billion was spent on public works projects, which included more useful ones, such as roads and bridges, to less useful ones, such as counting dogs. The Federal Art Project, a WPA project, was famous because it had artists paint murals in multiple locations across the country, including in post offices. Over 8 years, 9 million people were employed by the WPA, which constructed many public facilities and created over 1 million artworks by the time of its dissolution.
The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act, created a National Labor Relations Board to protect workers' rights and allow them to appoint their own representatives for negotiations. The Committee for Industrial Organization became a part of the American Federation of Labor and advocated for unskilled workers. The union between these organizations did split apart in 1936, but strikes, including sit-ins and union organization, continued. The CIO was reorganized as Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1938 and had 4 million members by 1940, including 200,000 African Americans.
The Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935 helped to regulate and control large corporations and prevent economically destructive growth.
The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, or the Wages and Hours Bill, which initially set the maximum working hours to 40 hours a week and a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour. Child labor under 16 or under 18 in dangerous industries was prohibited. However, this act did not apply to agricultural, service, or domestic work sectors of the economy.
The Reorganization Act of 1939 reformed the executive branch by creating the Executive Office of the President and allowed President FDR to structure his office and hire his staff more independently.
The Hatch Act of 1939 prevented federal administrators, except those at the highest policymaking levels, from actively campaigning to decrease the influence of money in the government. But we still have one more program to talk about, which just might be the most important New Deal program FDR created.
The Social Security Act of 1935 was a landmark piece of legislation that established unemployment insurance on the federal and state level. Older people, specific categories of retired people, and the disabled received financial assistance at $10 to $85 a month from a tax on employers and employees. Over 45 million Americans qualified for benefits by 1939, even though Social Security was not universal and required recipients to meet certain requirements. Overall, FDR enacted many programs, but how successful were they?
Well, some of FDR's programs were struck down in court. FDR attempted to add 6 more justices to the Supreme Court in 1937, which lost him a lot of popularity, although the court did cooperate with him more afterwards. Unemployment in 1936 was at 15%, which was down 25% in 1933, but was still very high. FDR, after a recession in 1937, then used Keynesianism, or deficit spending, to ramp up his New Deal programs. The debt was almost at $20 billion in 1932, but over $40 billion by 1939.
Opponents of the New Deal hated what they said was its waste, incompetence, and confusion. They accused FDR of embracing a socialist system with government regulations, instead of allowing business and the free market to operate more independently. The bureaucracy was expanded with hundreds of thousands of employees because of the New Deal.
Detractors also resented FDR's influence over the government and argued that he expanded federal government at the expense of the states. Many argued that the New Deal had not even fixed the Depression, as unemployment was still very high and consumption and production had not yet matched each other.
Supporters of FDR argued, however, that his reforms provided immediate relief instead of focusing on the economy. They also argued that his limited reforms had preserved the capitalist system and prevented further radicalism. FDR had also completed many public works projects that would benefit Americans after World War II and would increase post-war prosperity.
In fact, the FDIC, SEC, FHA, and a few other programs still remain today, the largest and most relevant one being is Social Security.
Over time, Social Security began accepting more people, including workers, dependents, and survivors, those with disabilities, and all workers above 62. Social Security also increased its payouts over time. Later on, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs included Medicare, which was subordinated to the Social Security Administration.
Some of the accessibility of Social Security decreased. However, when Ronald Reagan later raised full retirement age to 67 and made half of Social Security incomes taxable for individuals making more than 25,000 and couples making more than 32,000, Clinton raised the taxable Social Security income to 85% for individuals making more than 34,000 or couples making more than 44,000.
Even with these limitations, Social Security may run out of money in 2035 when their two trust funds run out of money to pay benefits. Only 83% of benefits could be paid if this happens. Congress will have to make changes to the system like they did in 1983 to restore benefits.
According to Social Security Administration, less funds are entering Social Security because the American population is aging and there are less workers than there used to be. Still, Social Security runs on deficit, and for it to be solvent, there will have to be changes in taxes and benefits. Depending on global and American economic stability, it might not be possible to fund Social Security through borrowing in the future.
The future remains unseen, and we don't know what Congress will do about the large problems facing Social Security. But still, I'd like to thank Lois for coming on to help me uncover the history behind Social Security and the New Deal.
Thanks for having me.
On the next episode of Tom Talks, we will delve into World War II, America's involvement in the war, and how former Axis and Allied powers view the United States' participation in the conflict. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.